Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining. This is Pecan Street's interview with DOE's Dr. Tony Reames. We're going to be talking to Dr. Reames about his role at the Department of Energy and how to achieve a just energy transition. Just while people are joining, I'll remind people that they can submit questions through the chat function in Zoom. We've reserved plenty of time at the end for Q&A, so please send us your questions there. And then I'm going to turn it over to Suzanne Russo, Pecan Street CEO, who's going to lead our conversation today.
That's right as my dogs start barking, sorry. Thank you so much, Dr. Reames, for joining us today. I'm really excited to be able to talk to you. I know that a lot of our partners and the community around the clean energy transition is also really excited for this opportunity to just hear directly from you about what you're doing at the Department of Energy, opportunities for more community-based organizations to engage in securing federal funding and more resources to help accelerate that energy transition. I'm going to if you don't mind, turn it over to you to introduce yourself so I can get this to stop behind me and then we'll dig in. Is that okay?
That's fine. Well, good afternoon to some, good morning to others. It's really great to join Suzanne and Pecan Street today. I'm currently a senior advisor on energy justice in the Office of Economic Impact and Diversity in the Department of Energy. And previously, I was a professor at University of Michigan, where I started a research group called the Urban Energy Justice Lab in the School for Environment and Sustainability, focusing on research that looks at inequality and equities across race, across socioeconomic groups, across geography, to really understand how we can create a more equitable and just energy future.
Thank you. And we had the pleasure of getting to know you, Dr. Reames, when you were at the University of Michigan. And you were the principal investigator on a really exciting NSF-funded project that's being carried out now with some of your colleagues. And we do some work with Dr. Johanna Matthew at the University of Michigan, who's in the engineering school, around data collection within homes, looking at how households use energy at a really granular level and how we can better leverage opportunities with advances in information technology and sensors to align demand with supply of renewable resources. And also layering onto that, how can we have all these home systems operate more efficiently just to generally save energy and save people money? And I would love it if you could just talk a little bit to get us started about the role that data and that information plays right now and being able to figure out what are those effective pathways forward that the philanthropic community, but also the federal government should be, or you would like to see them investing in to really accelerate the clean energy transition in a way that also achieves racial equity as an outcome that's designed from the beginning and just overall community benefits.
Yeah, it's interesting. Just before this call, we're talking about kind of the progress that has been made, over the last decade. If we think about the Great Recession, we had tons of money coming from the federal government to state and local communities. A lot of it focused on energy as a pathway to restart the economy. And it's very interesting that we're back in this place, a decade later. And so I started this work during the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act era in Kansas City, Missouri, looking at how communities were using particularly the Weatherization Assistance Program dollars. And so a lot of that research that I started was really trying to understand the relationship between energy consumption, housing quality, race, and income. And so that led directly to collecting data on those things, right? And realizing that we didn't have enough data about how households consume energy. We didn't have enough data on the energy efficiency levels that homes had. And so some of that data collection included qualitative interviews with households to understand their perceptions of energy consumption, perceptions of efficiency, but then actually getting the hard data from utility companies, which sometimes can be difficult, and understandably trying to respect privacy issues. And so that's one of the reasons we were excited to collaborate with Pecan Street. I think from my kind of 10 years of doing research using data from the Department of Energy's Energy Information Administration, which does a survey, national survey called the Residential Energy Consumption Survey. So they do it about every 4 years. And it really gives us an insight into how energy consumption varies across different socioeconomic groups, different demographic groups, different places across the country. But it's still not enough, right? It doesn't give us everything we need to know. It doesn't get us down to that granular level where we can really make impacts in communities. And so that's a lot of discussions that we're having at DOE about how we increase the capacity of that data collection, how we work with utilities to, protect privacy, but also use data to really make informed decisions about energy efficiency rollout, clean energy rollout, stopping shutoffs and higher rearages. And so starting from a solutions or risk perspective, and then trying to backtrack to what data do we need to collect to be more informed.
Thank you. And that's helpful insight, I think, into understanding how you're approaching your work at the Department of Energy, being the primary thought leader there around energy justice. And two-part question. One is, as Pecan Streets really sought to engage more in the space over the last year through our Center for Race, Energy, and Climate Justice, one of the fundamental challenges that we keep hearing from our community-based partners is the sort of misalignment between environmental justice and restorative justice, which particularly when you're talking about energy is very place-based, because a lot of those issues tie to redlining within communities and how that still plays out into quality of infrastructure and access to resources. But when we're talking about scaling clean energy solutions, we really need to drive to technologies and solutions that can work for the country and scale really quickly. And so as we're trying to figure out how do we engage more community-based organizations in helping us solve these problems and in developing solutions that work for everybody, there seems to be an inherent misalignment with, well, how does that actually achieve national objectives? And so particularly with the passage of the infrastructure bill and the commitments through the Biden administration for 40% of funding to go to these community-based groups, how do you see those solutions being developed and being deployed, being able to get access to federal resources to do that work? And then more broadly, what is your vision for energy justice over the next 3 years now, the rest of the term for the Biden administration? What do you hope to accomplish with your time?
Yeah, that's really, really great question. Kind of as I think about when I got into this work, like I say, the first thing that I did was begin to interview homeowners in urban Kansas City, about the opportunity that the stimulus funds provided. And again, I was focused primarily on the weatherization program, which for folks that don't know, that's the federal government's low-income energy assistance program, which is appropriated to states through block grants, and then states distribute it to local communities, primarily community action agencies. And, young PhD student, thinking I kind of understood this energy space. But I sat in living rooms after living rooms with, elderly, grandmothers, and most of them reminded me of the energy conservation efforts in the 80s, right? And so that was eye-opening for me, because people talked about, we heard this before from the government. We got money, we had contractors coming in doing work, we took out second mortgages on our homes. And, I sat on a porch with one lady, and she pointed to the different houses on her street of folks who actually lost their homes because of unscrupulous financing efforts by some of the contractors, all in the effort to make their homes more efficient and to save energy, right? And so that whole idea of consumer protection and how we make sure that we rebuild trust in Black and Brown communities when it comes to something that actually is supposed to benefit them, right? And so, a part of what we've been talking about with the infrastructure bill and the kind of $62 billion that's going to come to DOE for a host of energy interventions is how do we build that relationship with communities? How do we use the teeth that is included in Justice 40, this idea that 40% of the benefits, which doesn't mean 40% of the dollars, right? But how do the, because some of the things like research and development, won't be dollars that go to communities, but the research that's being done, when we think about what are the benefits of this research, what's the public good that's inherent to this research, actually goes to communities who have been underserved, left behind, underinvested. And so Shalonda Baker, who's the Deputy Director of Energy Justice, and I, as former professors, we spent, the last several months really going around the department and talking to our colleagues, about energy justice, what it means to us, what it means to communities, what are the principles of energy justice. She talked about restorative justice. So if that is our goal, if we want to correct the wrongs that the energy system has overburdened communities with, we have to think about distributional justice. We have to think about recognition justice. So treating people with respect, recognizing the individual needs and inequities that already exist, and then procedural justice. And I think that's probably one of the biggest ways that we can kind of institutionalize it. How do we get communities who haven't been involved, haven't been engaged in, kind of federal grant making, decision making at the state levels with PUCs, local governments, who are creating energy councils. And so really creating the infrastructure for individuals to participate in this public infrastructure through funding or through decision making or through like implementation and interventions at the household level.
Can you give me an example of how that might play out in a DOE project or an opportunity?
Yeah, so we're still waiting on our Congress to pass our 22 budget. So we've been able to use some existing resources to create some kind of pilot opportunities to really test this out. So one is called Communities Leap, which is local energy action planning. And so this is a technical assistance opportunity for about 24 communities across the country that's open kind of competitive process right now. But really, the way we created this opportunity is to say that we want to see relationships. So applicant has to be a collaboration between local governments, community groups, maybe the private sector, but we made sure that a community group is a real true partner in this application. And so when that application comes through, this group wants to create a clean energy future for their community. And so we want to test that out. We've changed the way we score the applications. So there's a few more points that actually go to making sure that there's a real authentic relationship with the community group that's a part of the application. Another one is called the Inclusive Energy Innovation Prize. So prizes allow kind of ideas to come in that might not be fully baked, but could be a really great idea. And we have a focus in there that, partnering with HBCUs, MSIs, or tribal colleges, because those are institutions that often don't get a lot of the big research and development dollars. And so our Office of Economic Impact and Diversity, tries to sit at the table for all of the funding opportunities that are going out and saying, hey, you haven't thought about minority owned businesses or diverse businesses. You haven't thought about HBCUs. And so really just trying to make sure that the language in these opportunities are there so people know that they can apply and know that it's available.
Mm. And that is also one of the other challenges that we're encountering is, the amount of effort it takes to write a Department of Energy funding proposal is significant. We churn them out on a regular basis at Pecan Street and have been doing it for a decade, and it's still just like such a lift for us. And for small community groups that would be lucky to even have 1 or 2 full-time employees, and they're really busy focusing on actually helping their community members, what would be your advice for them if they want to try to figure out how can we gain access to some of these funds?
Yeah. Definitely a work in progress, right? We're trying to think on our end, so we did, so the president signed an equity executive order, which charged every federal agency with looking at barriers to participation in kind of the federal complex. And so, we did interviews with community groups, different stakeholders, with, our different offices. And that was what we identified, that the barrier to entry to participate in, whether it's a, procurement contract from a grant, is just too high. And so there are some legal things that have to be in every funding opportunity that we have to go through for procurement, but really trying to reevaluate how we lower that barrier. And so, some of the things like creating technical assistance opportunities that may be distributed across the country, right? And so, unfortunately, DOE doesn't have regional offices like EPA and some of the other federal agencies. But what are the opportunities for us to, create technical assistance centers at labs or at MSIs and HBCUs, at community colleges? And so really trying to think about how we build a distributed infrastructure so people have a place they can go to understand and learn about opportunities, and actually, if they don't have the capacity to apply, have someone there that can help them get through that process.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's really exciting. I think that'll be a really big benefit. Well, I'm going to take it back up to a kind of a higher level. What are the big opportunities that you see for the clean energy transition and energy justice within that over the next few years?
Yeah, time goes fast, right? So I've been at the department since June. Everybody, a lot of people have been there since January, but we're all shocked, like, wow, it's almost been a year. To think through, some of these major transformational changes that we hope we can make. I think one is just the opportunity to be able to, walk around the department virtually, because I'm still in Michigan, but to have a deputy director for energy justice, to have a senior advisor on energy justice, to prepare to create an office of energy justice research and analysis, working with the Energy Information Administration, Office of Science, energy efficiency and renewable energy, and and having our colleagues actually say, hey, Tony, we have this project coming up. What are some of the things that we need to be thinking about? Has been very rewarding. I think, if we look at, again, the billions of dollars that are in infrastructure. So again, about $62 billion coming to DOE, focused on everything from increased energy efficiency for low-income households, clean renewable energy for schools, thinking about building a more resilient grid. So I know, sometimes when in energy justice, we think about energy affordability as one of the, major issues, but just reliable access is an issue that, touches everybody. But then we also know that inequalities exist in like restoration time, right? And so beginning to say it's, this equality versus equity, dichotomy. And so trying to pull people back to thinking about equity, because it recognizes the inequalities that existed before whatever intervention we're going to make. And so really, we are working on creating a set of energy justice principles for the department that will drive kind of everything we do. And I think that's what Justice 40 allows us to do, because it is a presidential initiative, hopefully working with Congress to make sure that Justice 40 can live outside of an executive order. And so it is, in legislation and institutionalized. So it's not, at the whim of whoever is in the president's office. And so, so I think that's one of our major goals, is how do we kind of institutionalize this energy justice idea.
Yeah. So you mentioned that you guys are starting at the DOE an Office of Energy Justice. And can you talk a bit more about that? Will that office be, issuing its own funding proposals or providing more kind of consultation to the federal government internally?
Yeah, both and the idea is that, creating a set of energy justice researchers, a set of funding and programming around energy justice. And so, how do our national labs, begin to think about, the justice implications of the research they're doing. How do we fund scholars and community researchers to actually identify the challenges, the energy challenges that exist in communities, and come up with solutions. And so it's really about rethinking this a very technical oriented department to thinking about some of the social and kind of human-based elements of energy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I imagine that's a big lift there. Again, from applying to so many funding proposals where a big part of it's graded on, the technical merit of your work plan and kind of the engineering that goes into that, the social aspects of it, and some of those intangible benefits that are hard to measure are difficult to put into a Department of Energy work plan, and they take a lot of work and a lot of time. Do you think that DOE is going to have more metrics around the social benefits? And could you talk about what those would look like to you? What would 40% of the benefits of federal investment around energy look like?
Yeah, so we're going through that process now. So the Justice 40 initiative, again, was a part of President Biden's climate change executive order. And so the Office of Management Budget, working in collaboration with the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council, has developed some interim guidance for each department to prepare, kind of their first evaluation of current investment benefits, at the end of the year. And so we're looking at things like, metrics around reducing energy burden. How does our work reduce energy burden in disadvantaged communities? How does our work in investments reduce pollution? And so part of that is identifying characteristics of communities that, could be considered disadvantaged, which is a task in and of itself, right? And there's still challenges with even using that type of terminology. But it does allow us to look at characteristics of disadvantage that can lead to increased vulnerability from climate change, and identify places that if we aren't targeting investments and benefits to those places, that when we begin to plan with this new funding, we can. And so we have a set of, probably about 25 to 30 metrics across our different programs. Some apply to all, some don't apply to others. But we're going through that exercise, which is really exciting because people are thinking about, okay, if we got, $100 million to do this project, where are the benefits of those investments going? Where have we reduced energy burdens? Where have we reduced pollution? Where have we increased solar adoption? Where have we increased resiliency in the grid? And so those type of, benefits and metrics that we're measuring.
And to jump back to data collection for a minute, I would imagine we need more data to baseline the current status, as you're talking about collecting on a national level, but also for environmental justice or community-based groups that want to be able to demonstrate the success of their work and demonstrate the impact. It's virtually impossible to do that around energy because it's virtually impossible to get this data from utilities. What are your thoughts around, are there other proxy measurements that can be used? Are there legislative mechanisms that you think would need to go into effect, or more funding for groups like Pecan Street, but that are grounded in different communities that come from within the community to collect that data?
Yeah. Thinking about, how do we crowdsource data, right? I think that, there are some levers. There are certain requirements that utilities have to the Energy Information Administration. So an example is outage data, right? I saw EIA just put out today that on average, US households, I think over the last year had 8 hours of power outages, right? So, think about that, a whole work day, the average person has been without power over the year. But that data is collected at the utility level, right? So the whole utility territory. So is there an opportunity to, kind of get that data at the zip code +4 level, or some other granularity, whether it's the, circuit or something, trying to figure out how. So we have those levers. Can we work with our state regulatory bodies to request that data? And then that gets rolled up to the federal government. And so I think it is, kind of coming up with some of those standards and then either getting them adopted, nationally or at the state level. I think another thing that the pandemic probably has highlighted, was this realization of, arrearages and shutoffs.
Yeah.
And so, you saw a growth of data reporting on those topics. And then you saw people saying like, okay, it's great to know in this utility territory, X thousands of people, had arrearages or had been shut off, but we don't know where those people are, right? So we can't, actually implement an informed intervention or solution because we don't know where people are. And so you saw calls for zip code +4 or census tract data. And so I think the more we tie kind of our solution to the problem, that realization that we need more granular data becomes more clear. And so hopefully that will inspire levers to, to make that happen.
Yeah. Yeah. It's, for example, you probably saw this report, but after the Texas winter storm here in February, where outages were a very big problem, obviously, there was no state level local data on who lost power and for how long. So some researchers funded by the Rockefeller Foundation ended up looking at satellite data and mapping where communities, which neighborhoods were dark at night. And that was the best estimate of who lost power and for how long. And that study revealed that census tracts that are a majority Hispanic or African American had their power off for 400% longer, or they were 400% more likely to have lost their power during that outage, which is a huge finding and somewhat absurd that had to be discovered through satellite data and looking at where was it dark and where was it light at night. And we also have some questions coming in about the REX data is great, but again, it's really virtually impossible to tie that to local impacts. And it does seem like without legislation, that's not going to get resolved. And until that gets resolved, the burden is on local community organizations to go out and collect all that information and demonstrate impact. And that's a really big lift. And again, when we're talking about access to federal funding, whether it's NSF or DOE or EPA, you have to have that kind of quantitative impact analysis on your work. I'm just wondering if you have any suggestions for, how can we as advocates help to accelerate that timeline, accelerate that ability to collect information. And I'll add, New York State, is in the process of creating an integrated energy data resource platform. Full transparency, Pecan Street's a contractor on that work, but I had been writing about it before we were hired to work on it. And it seems like a great model for New York that could be adopted federally, but really is not going to be effective if it has to go state by state, of states regulating utilities to share data and everybody figuring out on their own. Well, how do you protect privacy while providing useful information? How much do we pay utilities to update their systems to provide us with data? It's so critical, and yet that actually doesn't really seem to be a big legislative focus around this right now.
No, I think that's a really great point, Suzanne, is that how do we get the legislative momentum around, understanding the value of data, right? And understanding the value of geographic data. And so I think being in kind of a place-based focus administration highlights, we don't know certain things because we have data gaps. And so we're working on a data gap report. Several of our offices are looking at their capabilities. And so again, there's model data that the labs are doing, either using satellite data or running statistical models. But how do we begin to ground truth that? I'll use one example from a few years ago when USDA put out their food desert maps. They use various methods to come up with identifying food deserts. But then I had a colleague at University of Michigan that did some ground truthing here in the state of Michigan and found that some areas that showed up as food deserts actually weren't, and some areas that didn't show up were. And so it kind of takes this, top down and bottom up approach coming together in the middle to really get us useful data that we can use for policy. I use Illinois as an example because their utilities have to report consumption data. I think it's zip code +4. I'm forgetting right now, but even within that, there's some randomization to protect privacy that doesn't allow you to do like a holistic comparison, over years. So how do we begin to take, policies and legislation like that, continuously improve on it, and then spread it throughout the country? And so we almost need like a policy think tank for, for energy justice legislation, which would be pretty exciting.
Yeah.
Just an idea, right? Yeah.
The Urban Energy Justice Lab that you started.
It would have been, yeah.
Yeah. Well, and the Energy Equity Project, which I think also flowed out of the work you started at the University of Michigan, is getting going. And if anybody on the webinar isn't familiar with that, that's a great collaborative program that anybody can participate in, where we're just trying to figure out what are those data gaps, what data is out there that could fill those gaps, how can we work together to produce more of the research that's needed to baseline and then measure progress.
Yeah. That there are energy efficiency, renewable energy implementers who are out here trying to do energy deployment in an equitable way. But we weren't trying to do this in a kind of standardized approach. And so that, how do we standardize that either, within or outside government, but still trying to get all these sectors to work together? And I think, having those conversations is really key to, kind of moving us forward.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, you froze up at the beginning.
I think I did, yeah.
Explaining it. Yeah, do you mind just taking a step back and talking about that project?
Yeah. So a philanthropic funded project from Energy Foundation and Joyce Foundations that came out of a group of folks getting together at one of ACEEE, the American Council for an Energy Efficient Council economy, had their summer study focused on energy efficiency in buildings a few years ago, and kind of had an informal group of sessions focused on energy equity, energy justice. And the folks meeting said, we need to standardize our approach to equity, starting in the energy efficiency space and expanding that to broader clean energy. And so we were fortunate that they selected the Urban Energy Justice Lab to kind of take this project on, to be a convener, of a host of stakeholders to really say, what are the metrics? And I think we talked about this a little bit briefly, but like, what are the things we need to measure and track to really show improvement on energy equity? I look at some of the work that's happening in Europe. So they have their fuel poverty work. And so they, spent, it's interesting because they started that work in the 70s, just like the US started looking at energy affordability with the weatherization and the light heat program. But we kind of took two different paths in how we approach it. We view it here in the US, I think, more as like a temporary issue that we kind of, approach it with some, annual assistance once a year. But they are taking a more holistic approach, naming it fuel poverty, tracking how many households are in fuel poverty, having reduction goals to reduce fuel poverty, and attacking it from a technical and a social perspective. And so I think that's kind of the approach I think about in my mind too, like how do we bridge this gap between technical and social solutions to really reduce energy poverty, increase energy efficiency, renewable energy access. And so that's some of what the Energy Equity Project is doing.
Yeah. And well, what are some of the strategies that you think are effective, or some of the gaps in, in solving this? Because at a basic level, it really seems to all center back on resources, right? On it just takes money to make a house more efficient or community more efficient, plant more trees, get access to solar, be able to invest in electric vehicles. But that also overlays with communities that have been underserved for quite a while. And so it's kind of playing catch up and figuring out how to get everything cheaper, how do we get resources to the right place, and how do we restore justice? So it's kind of a big question, but if there are specific strategies out of Europe that you think are really effective that you'd love to see brought here, I think that could help all of us sort of wrap our minds more around how do you solve these big bears of problems at the same time?
Yeah, and I'm I gave a shout out to Europe, but I'm not saying they've solved it by any means. But I do think that, a good friend of mine, Diana Hernandez at Columbia, always says, name it, claim it, blame it. I think that's how she says it. But I think, one of the challenges we have here in the US is that, we have not fully stated, what our energy inequities are as a nation, right? And part of that is because of the data gaps that we've been talking about. Part of it is because we approach it in a piecemeal way. We have 51 state regulatory bodies that the federal government has various ways to kind of influence what decisions they make. Our two low-income energy programs are hosted by two different federal agencies. So we have the Energy Assistance Program in HHS. We have the Energy Efficiency Program in DOE. And so trying to make sure those programs coordinate a little more. There's also energy programs in EPA. And so I think a strategy that begins to kind of bring those things together to really kind of name energy poverty or energy insecurity, however we name it, as a national issue that we want to attack, that allows us again to bridge the kind of technical and social solutions, is going to be very key to really address this. And I think under the broad umbrella of addressing climate change, may be the way to do that. And I think that's what the combination of the infrastructure and Build Back Better bills may allow us to do. But it is, again, that recognition of the underinvestment, disinvestment, and injustices that already exist that are key.
Yeah. Well, and to your point about how we don't really have a good normative framework about energy equity and inequity, what does energy equity mean to you?
Yeah. It's so multifaceted that again, I think that's one of the challenges of why it's so hard to really solve, right? But it is. So I always say I grew up in kind of quintessential environmental justice community, majority African American in rural South Carolina. Was a big textile community until textile jobs left in the 90s. And trying to find ways to replace that tax base. Our county leaders brought in the state's largest maximum security prison and the state's largest landfill, things that nobody else wanted, in their community, and they still didn't replace the tax base, right? And so kind of that kind of foundational understanding of decision-making and environmental injustices has kind of guided, my thought about topics like energy and broader environmental injustices. And so, so one concrete example I'll use is a study we did in the Detroit Metro looking at where power plants were and juxtaposing that with where energy consumption is highest, right? And so you can map the power plants, map the communities that live around the power plants who were primarily Black and brown, low income. And then you can look at where the highest electricity consumption is located out in the suburbs, where people have larger homes, green lots, but don't have to look outside their window and see a smokestack. And so if we're talking about an equitable energy transition, the new systems cannot mirror what we've seen in the past, right? And so if we're talking about clean energy coming into communities, those facilities shouldn't be located and benefit the people who have not had to, bear the burden of the previous energy system. Those communities should be targeted first, right? And so how do we repurpose old coal plants, right? Could those be energy sites of the future that create jobs, that clean the air, that reduce the energy costs for people in those communities who have had to bear the burden of the system but almost couldn't afford it, right? And so again, it's that recognition justice. I always try to drive that home. We have to acknowledge the wrongs of our current and our past energy system.
Yeah, and this part of the conversation always gets a little bit tricky, but it's very hard for people that didn't grow up in low-income communities, in communities where you have polluting industries, that are zoned for residential and industrial purposes or commercial purposes. It's hard to understand why it is so important to address those restorative components. And especially, I think in the context of climate change and all of the anxiety and the urgency around just cutting emissions as fast as we can, taking a moment to slow that process down, or directing resources to where you're balancing quality of life, you're balancing economic development with emissions reductions. Those are conversations I have with a lot of people where they feel very conflicted about what's more important right now.
Yeah.
And I'm curious about your thoughts on how you would respond to that. From a clean energy perspective, how do you think about really demonstrating the value of the justice side of it, of the equity and equality side of it?
Yeah. If we look at a lot of the climate models, right, they don't take into account the kind of social cost of carbon. And, so we hear politicians, we hear communities say, like, we're bearing the burden of what's happening, right? So the urgency is there. The models and solutions don't include those burdens to say, here's the approach to actually address the concerns of those communities. And so if the push is to do this quickly, right, that's where I think we talked a little earlier about kind of large scale renewables versus making sure we're focused on something like energy democracy, where people generate their own energy, either through community solar or rooftop. And so how do we combine those things, right? We know our commercial industrial users, could be the beneficiaries of this large scale renewable energy, but for individuals and residential customers, how can that be the focus for these smaller scale distributed energy systems? And so how do we have a full continuum of the solutions and the interventions? And so a lot of our work has focused more on the residential side, because that's where we feel like we can make some of those kind of individual interventions. And like one of our policy priorities for Justice 40 is increasing parity in clean energy technology access and adoption. And so we're focused more on the residential side. Energy democracy is another policy priority for Justice 40. And so again, that is how do we, focus on community solar and community ownership of energy resources, microgrids to build resilience, community co-ops, and what does that look like? That maybe you have shared resources to do energy efficiency in communities where people are buying into this, and each home is being weatherized throughout time, and people are sharing in the benefits of those energy savings. And so it's hard for us to do that as a federal government, but like, can we offer small loans that allow communities to put those kind of plans together? Or can we, provide technical assistance and, figure out best practices across the country that we can then begin to share with communities, like, oh, maybe you could do it this way, or using, partners like you or some of the other kind of energy equity partners to kind of share that information.
Mhm. Yeah, access to resources is obviously the key, and we're getting some more questions coming in around that. We know what some of these solutions look like. It's just a matter again of being able to access the funding to go and invest in them. And you, for example, there's a program here in Austin that our local municipal utility has set up with a credit union, where households that qualified for weatherization assistance program for WAP funding, that maybe the whole scope of work that was identified wasn't able to be done with the resources, or the program has been filling up. So a lot of households that are eligible just aren't able to get that work done. They can go to the credit union and get a low to 0% interest loan. And it's also available to households that wouldn't be considered traditionally, loan credible, or, for whatever reason would have a harder time getting access to a loan. And we had applied for some funding to replicate that with solar, for a DOE project that was looking at how do we really get rooftop solar into lower income communities of color. But then it turned out that DOE restrictions prevented any of the funding from being used for direct financing. So even though we were just going to buy down the interest rate and kind of set up a loan guarantee pool with the credit union, we couldn't do it. And I'm curious if that issue's come to light already, or do you think that there is a good communication flow between organizations that are looking at these solutions and how to solve them locally, and then getting information to the federal government about how can we do that? How can we really unlock these opportunities that are out there? How can more communities participate?
Yeah, that's it's funny, we just had that conversation last week. So
Okay.
so I do think the kind of this first year of kind of like trying to baseline and level set where we are, and like I said, that equity analysis did identify some of the things that you just brought up. We did a study here in Michigan, looking at what we call the donut hole. So those households that make just too much to be considered low income, but like you say, don't have the credit worthiness to get traditional loans. And we found that 1 in 8 Michigan households fell into that coverage gap, to be able to actually do energy efficiency in their homes. And so what are the mechanisms for that group of households? So I think there's some great discussion going on about a national green bank, ways to think about working with state and some local green banks. The loan programs office at DOE will get a nice allotment of funds through the infrastructure bill and through BBB. And so how do we kind of reprogram some of those funds for smaller opportunities, like you're talking about, so maybe not the $100 million loans that they traditionally offer. And a great thing that we identified when we reevaluated our office is that our 1978 statute actually says that we are mandated to provide loans for low-income and minority communities and businesses. And so, so we're trying to figure out how, we get an appropriation of funds to actually do some of the things that you're talking about.
Wow. Well, that would be very exciting.
Yeah, that would be really exciting. Yeah.
Well, we just have about 10 minutes left, and I have so many more questions. But I think probably for our audience, just focusing in on opportunities that they could be getting ready for, your suggestions about how to get ready for those, with federal funding to do a lot of the great work that they're already working on and planning for. Yeah, do you have any advice around, related to the infrastructure bill, the $65 billion that's going to be coming out, and what kinds of programs you think might relate to that? Also, any other services or resources that communities could be looking to now to get ready to be competitive for that funding. And then the last one I have, sorry, this is a lot, but also within the infrastructure package, I think this sits outside of the $65 billion for grid infrastructure, but there's about $13 billion just for new innovation financing to set up a green, I think it's 4 green hydrogen hubs, carbon dioxide removal, innovation, battery recycling and manufacturing. And to me, energy equity and the clean energy, a just clean energy transition is not only about restorative justice, but it's really about how do we think about creating wealth in communities that have not traditionally had that opportunity. And there's going to be a lot of new opportunities for economic development as we transition to clean energy. And so how can the communities that are traditionally underserved with education and resources and kind of entrepreneurial training, is that something that you're looking at it as well? Is that innovation side of it? And how can we bring more of those opportunities to communities that have lacked that in the past?
Yeah. Wow.
Sorry, that was a lot.
No,
Whatever
it
you
was,
want. We've
it
got
was
10
no, it
minutes.
was it was amazing. It's like I said, I don't know if we shared our Justice 40 policy goals with you, but you were ticking them off. So but and that's been a really interesting conversation. Again, DOE is a very, research development technical. Oh, I see someone wrote about the MESIP program. Hey, MESIP intern. Yeah, so that's in our office too. So it's a minority student internship program. But so we actually included creating wealth in minority, diverse businesses, disadvantaged communities as a policy goal. And so we have that as one of the metrics that each of our program offices is, evaluating themselves across to kind of see, have they done that with previous investments? And again, a part of Justice 40 this first year is to say, okay, where are we? Let's level set, let's baseline, and then let's create plans and future investments to, get to 40% or above, right? We want to go beyond 40%. That's just the floor. But, thinking about, especially when you brought up this loan idea, there may be smaller companies that, they don't need $100 billion right now, right? So do we have the mechanisms in place so a company can get, 10, $15 million to start small manufacturing? Do we have the mechanisms for corporations or companies or individuals to collaborate to be able to come in and get some, some funding? And so, thinking about not just, the construction jobs and clean energy that may not be spatially located where communities are, but looking at the resources and capacities that communities have to create the type of industries there that would work for that community. And so it's not trying to fit everything everywhere, but really being contextual about so the hydrogen shot, the carbon dioxide removal that you mentioned, does every community want that? Right? And so I think being very intentional about what are the opportunities that communities want, and that's why I'm excited about Communities Leap, although it's just a pilot right now, but it's definitely something that Secretary Granholm wants to expand, where communities are given the technical assistance to create the plans. If they already have plans, then the technical assistance is helping them implement that plan, right? Because we know that there are some communities that have developed their climate action agendas and climate action plans. And so how do we move from kind of that R&D entity to the other D, which is deployment? And so that is, I think, again, another shift for our agency, but people seem excited about it. And we are collecting information from stakeholders to make sure we do that well.
That's great. I like the deployment, the D for deployment.
Yeah.
There's some good, I think, just tactical questions here that would be helpful to answer. Again, with an eye towards helping EJ groups start getting ready to be competitive in proposals and knowing they're maybe collecting the right impact data. So how will the Energy Justice Office track your impact? What are those metrics that you'll be looking for to know if you're making a difference, or for EJ groups to be able to report if they're making a difference?
Yeah, that's is that thinking about DOE or the Energy Equity Project? Because there's kind of the yeah, it'll be interesting to see when we do this first year of data collection over the next couple months. So the White House, which is actually leading the whole of government Justice 40, will be releasing some scorecards in early 2022. either at the department level or at the whole of government level to say how well we aren't doing across energy and environmental and other justice issues. We haven't determined yet how DOE will report that data out, but we do have, and I'll put I'll share the link, but we do have an energy justice dashboard. So you can search for that in Google, Energy Justice Dashboard DOE, as our first attempt to show like where investments are going. And I think this was very eye-opening for us as a department, and we want to continue to refine that dashboard and share that information publicly to be transparent about where our dollars are going. So that's one. And again, like you plugged for the Energy Equity Project, I think working on that, and ACEEE has their equity project. There's also GreenLink Analytics that is doing some equity stuff, and the Institute for Energy Justice. And so there are, some energy equity efforts that are, out there with kind of academic and nonprofit partners that would be great to engage into. The Justice 40 Accelerator, I know they have their first cohort and they'll be looking to do another cohort. And so, yeah.
Those are great resources for everybody. And we're recording this webinar. It'll be available as well on YouTube if anybody wants to reference or share it. And also we'll send out an email with the list of the resources that Tony just mentioned, everybody who's participating today. I'm curious, this sort of came up in the very first question we received about how do we change market forces so that government intervention isn't always required for the justice side of the clean energy transition. If you have an answer to that, and or if you could make one request of the philanthropic community, the one thing they could do that you think would really be shifting the needle in tandem with these epic federal commitments to justice, what would that be?
Yeah, I like to show in some of my presentations a carrot cake, because I love to put food in my presentations. But I do think about this, and Shalonda Baker and I have these conversations, like how do we recognize that there are limits to what the federal government can do, there are limits to what philanthropy can do, and some limits to the private sector, right? And so we recognize our limits and our strengths, and we begin to kind of layer those things together. I always talk about the commitments that both philanthropy and the private sector made, after the murder of George Floyd. Energy equity, energy justice is, one way, those organizations can, put their money, where their mouths were, right? Like this is investment, long-term investment you can begin to make in communities, viewing energy as a pathway to reduce household burdens, right? So I saw, I think my good friend Gloria Lowe from Detroit posted about gentrification, right? Can energy justice be a mechanism for housing stability? How do we use this to keep people in their homes? How do we use repairing, remodeling homes as a way to begin to reduce homelessness, right? Thinking about cities where you have many vacant homes, that's creating jobs, that's creating, already embodied energy in those buildings. And so, we're addressing climate change. And so really, energy not being necessarily a solution, but a pathway to hit all these kind of technical and social challenges that we have. And so philanthropy has a role in that, right? Kind of shoring up some of the unfunded costs, the health and safety issues that weatherization can't pay for. Private sector, hiring people, creating the supply chain for, new jobs in communities that may not be directly, installing solar panels, but somewhere down the supply chain line to, get us to increase solar access. So I think we all recognize our strengths and how we can work together, and we can have real impact.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Dr. Reames, for your time. That's a great way to close out, unless there's anything else that you want to add, but we're so grateful for you taking this job at the DOE in the first place, putting all of your amazing life experience and your knowledge to work for the benefit of everybody, but also your time today helping us get insights into where you're going to be taking the Department of Energy over the next few years. Anything you want to close on?
No, this has been a great discussion. I appreciate the work you all do to kind of highlight data gaps and to really create more information so we can make more informed decisions about how people use energy and how we can reduce those energy costs.
Well, thank you for that. Thank you, everybody who joined us today. If you have any follow-up questions, feel free to email them over to us at Pecan Street. And if they're for Dr. Reames, we'll do our best to see if we could get some help answering those. But thank you, everybody, and have a good rest of your day.
All right. Thank you for joining, everyone. All right, take care.